All right, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you have joined us tonight for this webinar. And I think it's a much needed topic for this exact moment of where we are, and also a topic we can always be discussing. I am a mom. My name is Mickey Scott Bay Jones, and among other things that I do in the world and titles that I hold, I'm a mom. And though my kids are big kids, these are the kinds of things that I have always thought about as a mother, that the kinds of stories that I have wanted to share with my small people as they've grown. And believe it or not, I actually still buy children's books, even though my youngest is 17. So they won't really sit in my lap and let me read them stories anymore. But there's always a child around that I can hopefully share something with. So whether you have little ones at home, you just love a child in your life, or you're not even sure who you would share this with, we're glad you're here. Um, so, first off, um, I would love to introduce Brian and Gareth. If you're here, you probably already know who they are, but I would love it if you would kind of, introduce yourselves to the folks here on the webinar. And um, I have some questions for you about this project and this book. I know you both quite well, as we have done all kinds of things together and created good trouble wherever we've gone, um, talking to people about things like transformative storytelling, like how do we have conversations across divides in our work, kind of in the realms of justice and faith and peace building. But I think people may not be aware of kind of the different strands of your work and why this became the book for now. So, Garrett?
All right. I was it's weird to go first because the idea for this project, which tonight we're launching this one, Cory and the Seventh Story, which I don't know if that's appearing reversed to you or not. It's
No, it's perfect.
but the idea came in a conversation from Brian to me, but I think Brian would say that the idea uh came to him and that there's no such thing as an original idea. There's just taking one idea and another idea and kind of putting them together, and we all stand on the shoulders of the folks who have generated stories before us. But that was about 8 years ago. Brian and I've known each other coming up on 20 years. I'm from just outside Belfast in the north of Ireland, and I get to tell stories as my work. Some of them are written stories, some of them are oral stories, some of them are in the form of retreats, and some of them in the form of festivals, and often just one-to-one, hanging out, having a cup of coffee, and talking. And um, in me, that comes from the genetic predisposition that Irish people have to tell stories, the cultural storytelling heritage in this society, the fact that my family are a family of storytellers, but also because I was growing up in the north of Ireland at a time of violent civil conflict. And the story that was told about our lives was a story about we're in despair and nothing can be done about it other than to defeat the other side, whoever the other side was. And the other side was determined by what side you were on, and you had to take a side. And there was something in me, partly because of my parents, partly because of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother in particular, and other people I was exposed to, that challenged me not to take a side in terms of an ethnic group or a partisan political aspiration, but that if I was to take any side, it would be the side of life. It would be the side of just more union and more fairness and more justice and less dehumanization, less cruelty. So I'm a storyteller. That may sound highfalutin. It's less highfalutin when you realize everybody is a storyteller. It's the thing that sets human beings apart from other sentient beings. Although I think it's possible that dogs and cats are storytellers as well. It seems to me they're telling each other stories. But for me, and I'll conclude my introduction with this and hand over to Brian, the part of the task of maturing in life and part of the task of helping co-create a better world, a safer and more compassionate world, is to become conscious of the stories we're believing and the stories we're telling. Because if those stories are not true, or if they are true, but we're not telling them in the most helpful way, at best, something is missing. And so this project is an attempt at learning what I suppose you could call some story literacy. What's about the kinds of stories human beings tell as a way to bring about peace and security in the world. And if we learn what those stories are, we can sort of see them when they're happening, and we can test them out and ask, does this one work? What would be a better way to address this legitimate need for peace and security? And it's a joy to be here with you, Mickey. Thank you for hosting us tonight. And it's been a total delight, one of the most lovely creative collaborations of my life to be engaged in this with Brian. And thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Gareth. So my name is Brian McLaren. I've always loved literature, always loved reading, always loved stories. I was the kid who, stayed up late at night reading a book and woke up early before school to read a book. So I've always loved stories since I was a kid. And became a lit major in college. I was a college English teacher, so I was really in this storytelling thing. I also was quite a liar when I was a kid. Like I would just exaggerate everything and make up stories. And so, and then I became a pastor, and I was a church planter, pastor, led a church. Some people would say there's an overlap between that and liars too, but there certainly is an overlap with storytelling because if you're dealing with the Bible, you're dealing with a library of stories over several hundred years. And when I was a pastor, I became very dissatisfied with the way I'd been taught to read the Bible. And when I was paying attention, having to preach week after week and actually pay attention to what was there, I felt there was a lot more going on. One thing led to another, and I started keeping a list of different kinds of stories that I saw coming up, especially in the Gospels and the New Testament. And one day I was sharing this with Gareth, and he said, gosh, he said it really helped him. And he suggested, why don't we do a book about this, and eventually evolved into becoming a children's book. And we self-published it with a wonderful young artist and named Heather Harris. And then when we sold out of all the self-published versions, another a major publisher picked it up, and that's what brought us to releasing this. Maybe the last thing I'll say is that I'm a parent. I have 4 adult children and 5 grandchildren, and so since having grandchildren, it has renewed my love for children's literature and the joy of reading to children, and then the joy of letting them read to you. So that's maybe enough about me, except I'll add, a lot of folks might be aware that I do some teaching with the Center for Action and Contemplation. People would probably know Richard Rohr's name. And it's been part of the work at the CAC to help people understand that spirituality and storytelling are very, very closely related, because when we pay attention to spirituality, we pay attention to our own stories and to the stories of other people. And maybe if we're very sensitive, we realize that the earth has a story, that animals and trees and plants, that every rock you pick up has a story. And I think if you are a believer in God, you'd say that God even has a story. So that story literacy takes us a long way.
Yeah, nice. Well, we're going to get into actually reading through the book. But before we get to that, I wanted to just ask you all a couple of questions to set things up. Now, my first experience with this project was this little book, the seventh story, Us, Them, and the End of Violence. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you went from this to the children's book and why.
The, the first idea was that we could write a children's book for grown-ups, because I think we both think that some of the deepest wisdom, in fact, probably maybe all of the deepest wisdom, is incredibly simple on the surface. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. These are very, very simple words. And we make things too complicated some of the time. It seems like the more grown up you get, the more complicated I can make things. And of course, being a brain surgeon requires a level of complexity that I don't have. Learning how to do many tasks that need to be done are very complex, but the deepest things are the simplest. And we felt that we had to kind of try to speak to the part of our readers that's open to the simple things, and that's the childlike part. So there's sort of three versions of this story. There's this fable, Cory and the Seventh Story, which is a story with a narrative involving animals discovering stories in the world and how they're going to respond to the conflict in their society. Then there's also a kind of a poetic myth that's in that seventh story, Us, Them, and the End of Violence, which doesn't have animals in it. It's a story about a kind of an archetypal group of people confronting the difficulties of reality and ultimately deciding that the only way to be a true hero is to surrender your selfish desires in favor of ever increasing participation in the common good. And the common good isn't just human beings, it's the whole ecosystem. And alongside that, we decided that despite what I just said about keeping things simple, that we needed to complicate things by writing some essays, interpreting things, and kind of talking about politics and culture and history, and particularly a theorist called René Girard, who has some profound ideas for understanding how human beings develop our desires and then project our negativity and our conflict onto others. And there are actually there are more ideas bubbling away about the future of this project. There's potential sequels to the Cory book. There's a conversation. Well, there's actually some work already been done by another Brian, my partner Brian Ammons, on a young adult novel version of the story of Cory. But ultimately, the reason we entered into this was because we feel that the deepest and most profound things are the simplest things.
Yeah, Brian, what would you add to that?
Well, maybe on a personal level, I'll just say Gareth's enthusiasm about this really carried it a long way. And then we had to work, as he talked about, simplifying a story down to, I don't know, 850 words or something is a pretty big challenge in a children's book. Of course, when you work with great illustrators, they help tell the story for you in pictures. So your words, in some ways, are commentary on the illustrations. But people will probably be watching this, since we're recording it over a long period of time. But the three of us are having this conversation right now while two major wars are going on, and horrible things are happening. And one of the things, whenever a war breaks out in the real world, we see is people retreat into old stories. The only way we can be safe is if we dominate and crush our opponents. The only way we can be safe is if we kill those horrible people who are dominating us. A whole series of stories flow out. And I think, unfortunately, many older people get to a place where they're so aligned with stories that if you criticize their story, they think you're criticizing them. And so then they just shut you out. And if we could help children and younger people and anyone of an open heart to realize that you can disentangle your identity from some of these stories and imagine yourself living in another story, well, that feels like one of the necessary things that has to happen in our world on many levels. So that's deeply motivating to us all, I know.
Yeah. And also, I think what happens in times like these, when there's so much pain and stress, is the desire to protect our children, right? To
Yes.
protect those with an open heart. And so, I wonder, I think some people would argue, why do we want to, why burden our children with transformative storytelling, right? Like,
Yeah.
why not just tell them fluffy, sweet stories without all this trying to teach them a lesson kind of a thing,
Yeah.
like, is this too much for our children to bear, to have to think about these kinds of things? What would you say to families that are wrestling with that?
I think kids are going to be thinking about it anyway. You can't, I'm not a parent, but my experience with the parents I know is that you can't prevent your children coming into contact with the world and with the story told in the world. And I would say that the opposite of transformative storytelling, as we understand it, or as I understand it, is not fluffy and sweet. And the opposite of transformative storytelling is separation, scapegoating, selfishness. Get them before they get you. Be scared, hide. Frankly, take as much as you can get. Transformative storying actually does allow for a version of the fluffy and sweet that lasts. It's a version of the story in which love is stronger than death, in which sharing what little you have, if you have little, is what multiplies it. And I don't mean that the little crumb of bread you have is going to magically multiply into a loaf of bread, but when it is shared with another person, you're building community, you're building allyship, you're not alone, you're less isolated. And we're not pretending. I mean, this book actually doesn't pretend that bad things aren't going to happen. I think it just shifts, I guess you'd call it shifts the locus of the story away from prophesying always bad, or that the bad are the biggest, or the bad are the most powerful or most important. Now, these are not the kinds of things I would say if we were on a Zoom webinar with people who right now are in urgent need of emergency, of rescue, right? Any more than when we talk about the peace process in the north of Ireland, you can talk about the peace process in the north of Ireland in a way that insults the memory of the people who died before the peace process happened. Or you can talk about how, there's been a 90% reduction in the politically motivated homicide rate in the 25 years since the peace agreement was signed here. That still means that 10% of the number of people that were killed in the previous 20 years were killed in the last 20 to 25 years. And it is not a comfort to the people who are the statistical outliers to say, well, you're a statistical outlier. But you'd have to be crazy or just obtuse, or perhaps I'm not communicating clearly enough. You'd have to be almost willfully not wanting to accept that there are good and beautiful things in the world, and that peace is possible, and that the evolution of union between human beings is possible. If you were to respond to a story like this just by saying, well, what about these terrible things that are happening over in this particular place? Two more things on that. In my experience of knowing some survivors of grievous violence, it is often the people who have survived the worst things that are the most proactive about transformative storytelling and proactive about trying to build bridges. And the second thing is, I was reading someone today quoting a writer who said, "These are sober times." That was the phrase. These are sober times. And I think anyone with compassion on the surface of their being recognizes these are sober times indeed. But they wrote that statement in 1983. And my sense is that anyone who has eyes to see can always find things to say about which these are sober times. They've always been sober times, and they've always been life-giving times. And some of the human race are suffering more than others, there is no doubt. And the job of the rest of us who may not be suffering as much or may have some more resources is to figure out what we can do to support them in their suffering or to prevent further suffering come to others in the future. So that's, I think, transformative storytelling is not it's not going to make kids feel more scared. It actually might help them feel more empowered to live a life of meaning. Of course, you titrate the dose about sharing the graphic details of violence or war with people depending on their age and their desire for understanding those things. But you can't hide the world from people, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't.
Yeah. Brian, anything you'd add about that?
Well, I think Gareth, you covered it very well. You know, any of us who've raised children know that children are paying attention, and the more you try to shield them, very often the more curious they are. I remember as a child, my dad, of course, I grew up during the Vietnam War years, and my dad was not super demanding about a lot of things, but one of the things he demanded was that after supper every night, my brother and I would sit with him in the living room and watch the evening news. Some people will remember the name Walter Cronkite. And we would watch the evening news, and I hated it. I didn't want to be there. I wanted to be out playing. I had no interest in it. And my dad said, you need to understand how the world works. And I did not make it easy for him. I complained and all the rest. But you know what? I remember those old-fashioned weather boards, and I started learning how low pressure systems and high pressure systems work. And every night they talked about something called the Dow Jones Industrial Average. I had no idea what it meant, but I was at least aware that there was this thing called finance and investors in the world. And of course, I learned about the war every single night and the death toll. On my 14th birthday, he was still requiring me to sit and watch the news. And on my 14th birthday, it was the day of Kent State, the Kent State killings. And I remember that night at the age of 14 thinking, oh, shoot, I'm growing up, and this is the world I've got to live in. So I think kids want to be good kids. You know, maybe there's some who don't, but it seems to me just about everybody wants to be good. Here's the trick, though. If nobody gives them a story that will help them be a truly good person, they can find themselves in their desire to be good going and having some unintended consequences. So that's another reason I think teaching kids this story literacy is we're doing them a huge favor, giving them a major blessing. And of course, as Gareth said, you don't push on people things that are inappropriate for their age or situation. But general story literacy, good idea, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And, my background is in child development way, way back. And, I think we have this popular idea of like not shoving things down our children's throats, right? Especially maybe those of us who have come from something that felt very restrictive, and maybe now we've become more progressive people, or we've changed our views, and it was a fight, right? Like we fought for this change in our belief system, right? And so then sometimes there's this, we don't want to tell our children what to believe, but children want to be guided, and they need to be guided. They don't just get our values by osmosis. Like just because they live in your house does not mean they are going to end up with the same values. And frankly, for some of us, we're trying to figure out what our values are. You know, we go through these changes as we are adults, as we're parenting, and something like this actually helps all of us figure it out at the same time. We learn with our kids,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So I really think that this story can help those of us who are still trying to figure it out as big people. And then as we sit with those children, trying to think through these stories and where we've believed them,
Yes.
and maybe it'll be a shortcut for them and not have to go through as much as we had to go through. So let's read through this story and hear it for ourselves.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share the screen, and you'll be able to follow along as Brian and Mickey and I do what is the first public performance of Cory and the Seventh Story, an auspicious event if ever there was one.
While you're bringing that up, Gareth, I'm just remembering a theologian I once talked to said the Bible was never meant to be read; it was meant to be heard, and I think there is something magical still about listening to a story. So I hope everybody can settle into their child selves again as we read.
All right.
If you press play, I think it'll go full.
Yeah, and are you seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is Cory and the Seventh Story, with these beautiful illustrations by Anita Schmidt. And as is the wont of Zoom, I am needing to do a little bit of movement so I can actually read the text. There we go. All right. Cory the raccoon lived in the old village, along the clear stream, near the deep forest, within the broad meadow.
Each day, Cory walked through the village, greeting friends and neighbors, while Cory's friend Owl flew along.
One day, Cory and Owl were surprised to hear angry growls and howls. They followed the noise to Fox's front yard, where they saw Badger stealing Fox's bright blue, shiny new bicycle. Badger had always been big and loud, but Cory had never seen him be a bully before.
The next day, they heard more howling and growling, this time in front of Badger's house.
One of the elements of the Seventh Story is that nothing has to be perfect, and so Fox and his friend Weasel had gathered some friends to threaten Badger. Badger knew he was outnumbered, so he gave the bike back and slunk away, tail between his legs. Cory and Owl were afraid.
So much fighting. What's happening to our village? They asked.
Every day, Cory and Owl noticed new problems. One day, Skunk was giving a speech in the village square. Some of us, oh, I'm sorry, you take that, Mickey.
Some of us have fur and feathers. We are clean and good. Others have scales and slime. They are dirty and bad. Let's drive these invaders away forever.
You're a terrifying political campaigner, Mickey. It broke Cory's heart to see friends with shiny, smooth skin run into the forest in fear. Cory protested.
Turtle, lizard, snake, and frog aren't invaders. They're part of this village.
When Badger saw that many of his neighbors were upset and afraid, he got an idea.
I'll build a shiny object factory because everyone likes shiny objects, and I'll get rich.
At first, the shiny objects made everyone feel happier. But then Cory and Owl noticed that those with fewer shiny objects felt envious when they saw neighbors with more, and those with more felt superior to the neighbors with fewer. That wasn't the only problem.
Cory and Owl also noticed that Badger's shiny object factory was filling the air with smoke and polluting the stream that had always run so clear.
A few neighbors are ruining things for everybody. Who will help us?
Owl asked.
Our village is in trouble.
Cory said with a sigh.
But what can just two of us do about it?
For a long time, they watched the water flow by and felt very, very discouraged.
Suddenly, a large brown animal appeared on the other side of the stream, a beautiful creature they had never seen before.
Who are you?
Owl asked.
I am a swift horse. I am a poet. I travel the world seeking wisdom and beauty, and I share what I find in well-chosen words.
Cory and Owl
Go ahead,
told
Brian.
Cory and Owl told Swift Horse about the troubles in the old village.
Who will help us?
Owl asked.
Maybe you are the ones to change the story of your village.
Swift Horse said.
Just the two of us?
Cory asked.
You can invite your neighbors to come together for a feast.
Swift Horse replied.
That would be a start.
Cory and Owl went through the old village and asked everyone to prepare a big feast in the town square. Then they rushed to the forest to find turtle, lizard, snake, and frog. They invited their smooth, shiny-skinned friends to take the seats of honor.
One by one, their neighbors sat down at the table and began to eat. Badger, weasel, fox, and skunk were a bit sulky at first. But the food was so delicious that everyone forgot about the bullying, fighting, running away, showing off shiny objects, saying mean things, or feeling hopeless. It was good to be together again.
Swift Horse arrived at the feast and began to walk around the table. She sang a song to the slow rhythm of her hooves. Clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop.
Was this me?
It's you.
I'm not going to sing it. 6 old stories wherever we go. The same 6 stories are running the show. The story of power to dominate, of striking back with fury and hate, of pointing at others to shame and disgrace, of running and hiding to find a safe place, of being stuck in self-pity for the pain we've been through, of me having more shiny objects than you. The same 6 old stories steal freedom and laughter, so nobody lives happily ever after.
Suddenly, Swift Horse let out a loud whinny. Then she began clip-clopping around the table in the other direction.
There's a new 7th story to live by, my friends, a story that doesn't turn us against them, of working for fairness in all that we do, of not striking back when others strike you, of facing our problems, not running to hide, of not letting difference make us divide, of growing through pain to compassion for others, of not wanting more than our sisters and brothers. The new 7th story I'm singing of is the story of peace, and the hero is love.
Some of the villagers grew angry.
We like our old stories.
They shouted.
We don't need your silly 7th story. Why don't you just leave us alone?
Swift Horse smiled with love at everyone.
When the poet is gone, the story lives on. It's now up to you to help the story come true.
Then she turned and galloped away.
From that day forward, Cory and Owl, along with turtle, lizard, snake, and frog, kept the seventh story alive. Each week, they invited their fellow villagers to join them around a glowing fire at the edge of the deep forest.
Whenever they gathered, they sang the song they learned from Swift Horse, and they dreamed together about how the old village could become a place of peace where everyone could live as neighbors in the seventh story of love.
Yay.
Back. And the same number of people are still in the webinar that were there at the start of the book. That's a good sign.
That's a good sign. So, how do you all feel about it reading it back? You know, sometimes when you read your own work later, it does something to you, or you know, you realize what was missing, or you know, maybe nothing's missing, or you know, I just want to know your reaction to hearing those words.
Why don't you go first, Brian?
Well, can I tell you, Mickey, hearing you read the parts, the voices with a lot of energy, I mean, this is part of the delight of reading aloud, and especially reading aloud to children. Although if we read aloud more adults to adults, I'm sure we'd have the fun too. But, you know, we usually think it's only professional actors and actresses who get to act out parts and make stories come alive. But it's when, you know, a lot of us who are parents, we discovered our inner Ham, our inner actor. And so that was the main thing. It just is fun to hear it read out loud. Yeah.
I was feeling similarly, actually, Mickey, hearing you read. I was thinking about you as a parent and the kind of voices that adults put on when we're talking to little kids in particular. But
Yeah.
I think part of what's happening there is that children and childlike adults, and I don't mean childish adults, I mean adults who have connected with a sense of wonder. And often those are people who've been through immense suffering. I met somebody at the weekend who's a grown up and is going through some acute suffering, and such kindness flowed from him that it called forth kindness in me. Just being in his presence, the same way, like being in the presence of a child who's suffering, your heart goes out to them and you want to do everything you can to protect and care for them. But being in the presence of a child who's experiencing wonder can activate that in the grown-up. There's a peace theorist called John Paul Lederach who said to me once that, you know, we teach children, share your food, don't hit the child sitting beside you in the classroom, don't steal from them, and if somebody's acting out, well, you know, that's not good, but you got to understand they're having a hard time at home, right? And really teach this to children. But then as we grow up, we complicate things and we stop teaching that to adults. So we don't say share your food. We say make sure you keep what you've got, you know, and then let a little bit, maybe a little bit, you can give away. And if they hit you or hit somebody else, don't pay any attention to the benefit of the doubt or to grace or to mercy. Defeat them at all costs. Hearing your voice reading that story made me think about the voice we use with children and how the childlike calls forth a different way than this oppositional energy or this individualistic energy.
Yeah. Well, I have some more questions, but I do want to open it up for questions. We have the Q&A box enabled. I don't know if, I think people can chat us questions to hosts and panelists. So feel free to, you know, add questions, folks. That is open now. And while we wait for some of those questions to come in, I'll continue to ask some questions of y'all. The thing that is really also live for me right now as a parent, as someone who obviously knows my own flaws, is how we can have these conversations with kids, how we can have this, you know, I'm interested in transformative storytelling. I have learned a lot from you, particularly Gareth, about, because I've watched you do this, um, you know, like evolve a story, you know, how you have told a story maybe, and then 5 years later, you're telling it a little bit differently because you're able to see the redemptive arc more, you know, that kind of thing. Um, but so many of us are in the middle of our own stories, right? In the middle of painful periods. Um, and so it's like, how do we even begin to enter into transformative stories for our kids, for ourselves, when we don't really know how to do it, you know, and we're still telling the stories in those other 6 ways, right? We haven't figured out how to tell them with love.
Yeah. So, you know, if you're one of my teachers says, if the train is coming and you're standing in front of the train and you can jump out of the way, then you should jump out of the way. And if you can take someone with you and rescue them, you should take someone with you and rescue them. And so nothing that I'm about to say suggests that if you're in imminent danger, that you should just stay there unless you have no option. So a lot of what I think about storytelling, it's the kind of thing that if the person who wrote These Are Sober Times in 1983, I'm sure there were people who read that in 1983 and they responded by engaging in the long-term work of telling a new transformative story. Of course there were, just as there were in 1883, you know? So one thing is to get our heads around, often human beings are wanting an answer to what's happening right now, and they want a perfect answer. And social media, you know, has 1,000 upsides, but one of the downsides is the notion that not only do we want an answer right now, we believe everybody's supposed to have the kind of answer that in the past we would only have asked so-called experts or people actually involved in the directly in the work, and that we then have to publish our answers before we've even thought them through. And it's not just that we don't spell check those answers, we don't wisdom proof them either. It's not just, you know, facts that get misshapen in social media. It's whether or not something is actually wise. So all that said, I think there are actually 2 or 3 active practices we can take that will start to heal our relationship with story, with the story that, as John O'Donohue would say, that enshrines the ugly as the normal standard, because that's what electronic media does. And I'm not blaming journalists. We're all part of the electronic media. We're having this book launch via electronic media right now. But the tendency of electronic media is to take us toward enshrining the ugly as the normal standard. And there could be good reasons for that are to do with compassion and wanting to know about the suffering in the world. But it can often leak out in a way that just leaves us feeling despair and complete disempowerment. So to heal our relationship with the broken story, 3 practices. One is to breathe more slowly. It's the time-honored, universally agreed upon element of all spiritual practice in all spiritual wisdom traditions is slow down. And you can't slow down your body without slowing down your breathing. And whether you call it meditation practice or just breathing a little more slowly and all the things that flow from that, if you start to try to breathe more slowly, even just once a day, and you hold yourself to that once a day for 1 minute, you won't be able to stop yourself doing more of it. It's good for you. And it has all kinds of, you know, psychological, physiological benefits, but I think it helps bring us more into close alignment with reality. That's number 1, to breathe more slowly, and any kind of life-giving meditative reflective practice. The second thing is there's no substitute for being in a close circle with 3 or 4 other people who are also committed to a conscious journey of spiritual growth and of moving toward a story of union and supporting the common good. We can't do this on our own. It's another one of the benefits of electronic media is you may not even know, if you don't know someone in the town or city where you live, you can find them online. And there are plenty of places. The Center for Action and Contemplation is one of the most well-known and wonderful examples that are facilitating people being in circles of support, of deepening trust, and of learning strengths and weaknesses, emphases and de-emphases, where you can be useful in the world, where it might be useful for you to step back, to remember that some of the people we hold up as the spiritual masters, which I think so a strange phrase to call someone a spiritual master, but some of the people we hold up as this are people who actually lived in the desert or lived in a monastery, and they weren't, for most of their lives, they weren't in situations of imminent threat or danger, but they did, through their prayer, meditative, reflective practice, learn more about the world that could teach us. And then they were always prepared to go out and go into the world. And there's a lot of people who've lived in monasteries who were under threat from people outside the monastery who didn't like the fact that they were teaching things like we should all love one another. And then there's a third practice in addition to breathing and being in circles, and that is when Brian's dad was having him watch the news every night. There was basically one form of news available on television at the time, and there was one Walter Cronkite. And frankly, the integrity, the truthfulness, the wisdom of the news largely depended on what Walter Cronkite wanted the world to know, and what CBS, he was CBS, right? And what CBS and the corporation called CBS had decided was, quote unquote, newsworthy. Some of it is, some of it's not. And the same goes today. So the third practice is, I would put it this way, the sources of information coming at you, whether they are news, media, or whether they are books or movies, TV programs, music, whatever it might be, the sources of information, you might want to ask, if I knew this person in the real world, how wise would I think they are? And how much of my mind would I want to surrender to them? And this word surrender is important, because I guess that would be another part of the practice. Don't just unconsciously surrender to the information sources that are bombarding you. But at the same time, this is not me advocating for, these lovely dear folk who say, I've done my research, when actually what they've done is they've just looked at a different website than the one that you looked at. You have to actually ask people who know what they're talking about. Like I said, I would not want brain surgery done on me by someone who wasn't a brain surgeon. And so consider the sources and ask, do these people seem to be as wise as the people I'd want to be leading me? And that doesn't mean you just, repudiate them if they're not. We have to find loving ways to call forth the best in journalism. And so we should be supporting journalists who want to live with integrity, and storytellers who want to speak story with integrity. But never doubt the story you're telling is having an influence on somebody.
Well, we're getting tons of questions now. So I want to see how many we can get through before our time is up. The first one's kind of the easiest one. What's the age range for this book?
Yeah, so there's kind of formula in children's literature of how many words are suitable for each age. So this is pitched at 5 to 8 year olds. Obviously, you could read it to a younger child as well, but 5 to 8 year olds is sort of the sweet spot for a book this length.
Okay. If you really work on the voices, you might be able to engage those younger ones. They'll still sit there. They'll hang out.
That's right. I think that's right.
Also, I want to know if there's an actual song for what the horse sings. Do we have some?
We don't have a tune yet, do we?
Well, actually,
No?
I've been working on it, and I actually had 2 of my granddaughters sang it, and I've got it recorded. I just haven't figured out how to make it available yet.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to make that happen. And there's some other, potential collaborators in the question.
Oh,
So,
good.
make sure you see that because there was a question about I think a middle school
Yeah.
version, and then also doing it as a curriculum in churches, that someone has already kind of done some work around that, Vacation Bible School, and even doing it in theater with theater kids and maybe even some sort of game.
Mhm.
So, are you all thinking about some of these other ways to talk about transformative storytelling, even if it goes beyond Cory and the Seventh Story?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I kind of alluded to this at the the, the start of the call. Um, the this doesn't belong to anybody. The concept of transformative storytelling doesn't belong to anybody, or maybe belongs to the whole human race. So I would say, I think we'd both say, like, take this idea of stories that move us toward union and away from separation, and go anywhere that's life-giving with that. As for the thing that we call the seventh story, and Cory and the Seventh Story, as I've already said, there's potentially a young adult novel along the way. There are a couple of sequel ideas for uh, the, the 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 book that's there, and we're open to hearing from anybody that has creative ideas and who wants to run with them. And there have, as you say, already been some wonderful people who've done like Vacation Bible School curriculum versions. It's one thing we should, maybe Brian, we can both say something about kind of uh, the kind of religious background to the story doesn't mean that it has a religious foreground. And while we both come from the Christian tradition, this is not an exclusively or a sectarian Christian book. It will be for others to judge whether we've done a good job, but there's nothing, I think there's nothing in this story that requires readers to be from a particular religious tradition. It probably has more of a cultural, I mean, it certainly has a cultural root in the kind of shared culture that Brian and I have in terms of the stories we grew up with. But the intention is for this to broaden beyond the religious tradition that we're a part of, and at the same time it has to speak to that tradition, because Christianity has such a mixed history when it comes to telling stories that promote nonviolence or stories that promote violence and separation.
Yeah, just it's funny we're talking about that because just the other day I have a friend, someone I do some work with, who is a woman in her 40s who's Buddhist, and she's someone who I think lives the seventh story beautifully. And I gave her a copy of the book and just wrote in the front, to someone who lives the seventh story. And she wrote me this long note a day or two later and just said how much that meant to her and how much she cherished the story. And so, yeah, I think the truth is a lot of people, Gareth, from your and my religious tradition, would hate this story. Because they really are bought into the domination story themselves, or the revolution story, or the accumulation story themselves, and they like their religion for what happens after they die, but they have other stories they want to live by, and they think it's right to live by in this life. So I think one of our hopes, and one of the reasons we wrote the book in this way, is that I have no hope that people of my religion are going to switch stories to it fast enough and in large enough numbers to get us out of the mess we're in. But I do have hope that people in all different religious and secular traditions, that enough of us within each of those traditions will start raising our voice and setting an example of a different alternative. That to me is where I think there's more hope. And it's probably a better strategy from the beginning.
So our friend Deneen Akers, who is also a beautiful storyteller, and has written a gorgeous children's book, hopefully helping us reframe our idea of God, asked if you all have any plans to read this to children in public. Like, are you going to have events where kids can read this, can hear it from you all, or how would you encourage other people to do that? You know, storytelling events for kids. Is that one of the things you're thinking about?
Well, maybe we will after tonight. So thanks to Deneen for that suggestion. Yeah, of course, our hope is that parents and aunts and uncles and babysitters and teachers and all the rest will read it to kids, because that's part of the relationship. But if that could be helpful, Gareth, I'm in if you are. So we
Absolutely.
we can record that. That'd be fun.
Anybody wants to invite us, we're always open to that. There's another question about, do we have a version of the story for Congress? And and I want to say this, you know, it is hard to be a public representative. It is a personally very taxing life, even if it is feeding your ego, even if it is giving you these fringe benefits that other people don't get access to. So the first thing I want to say is that for most people in public office, that is hard, no matter what your politics are. And so I've always wanted to be of support to people who put their head above the parapet and run for office, and to help support people who will champion policies that promote the common good and that promote moving toward more of a sense of union and don't equate justice with vengeance. We're not looking for perfection here, because if I was a politician, I wouldn't be perfect either. We're looking for a focus on the story that will enable more safety and more compassion to flow to everybody. And if this story helps affirm people in our understanding, we are born into stories of separation. We can't help it. We were born into it. And life is kind of a sort of a journey of defecting from those stories of separation. And your defection gets accelerated often through tragedy. If it doesn't even more firmly entrench you in the story of separation, and through, let's call it luck. And I mean luck in the Celtic spirituality sense of the term, which is more like serendipity. I learned what I've learned because people taught me. Right? It's not a mark of character that I accidentally bumped into peacemakers when I was in my mid-teens. It's not a mark of character, and it's not something I can take credit for, that I stumbled across a particular book, or that I had parents who told me don't take sides in this conflict. The thing you can take credit for, although once you start doing it, you don't want to take credit for it, because that question just becomes irrelevant, is the choices you make with the things that have flowed to you, the steps you take regarding the things that have flowed to you. So I have no desire to emotionally beat up any more members of Congress, even the ones who try to beat me up, even the ones who want to promote policies that hurt or harm me or people that I love. I certainly want to hold them accountable and speak a word of accountability, but I want to call them into a story, a seventh story that shows this, and this is really, really important. The problem is not the desire for belonging or the desire for safety. The problem is when you enact your desire for belonging and safety by taking belonging and safety away from other people. And the problem is not people who want their lives to be valued. It's when they value their lives over and against the lives of others and enact that at a policy level. A story like this is, I mean, my goodness, if people read this story and they end up dividing the world more into, there's two kinds of people who believe Cory in the seventh story and people who don't, not understood the story. Yeah, that's enough for me to say on that.
Yeah. Well, and I think what this book also invites people of any age into is um, the option, the possibility of changing their mind.
Mm.
Yeah.
We can actually change our minds about what story that we're living in, about what stories are possible. And I think that's why what I'm seeing in the questions is so many questions about how can we teach it with this age group or in this way or in that way, because it often takes many times or many angles for somebody to change their mind, to be open to a new way. And Brian, I know you've done some work around trying to make more materials for parents to talk to their kids about spiritual things, about different ways of looking at the world. And so, I also ask that for myself selfishly as a parent of bigger kids, is how can we get some, guidebooks or something that can help us have conversations at every level. I've done that with my work on the People Supper, helping people come
Yes.
across difference, and how can we have conversations that are largely based in telling our stories to one another,
Yeah.
because it's hard to argue with someone's story. You might argue with the facts that they hold or believe, but when somebody has a story, you can learn to hold their story. And so I just think we're seeing a lot of people interested in how do we teach our kids to hold different stories. So I know we're at time. I would love for you all to share a little bit about where they can get the book, the larger project, what's up next. Brian, I know you have a podcast happening right now as well. So how can people be in touch with you all and know what's happening?
Go ahead, Gareth.
Well, one thing, just in response to the last thing you said, Mickey, I think that we need to invite the possibility that kids are going to teach us, and there needs to be a partnership there, of course. But I'm much less concerned about the attitudes and stories being told by younger people than I am by those often being told by people my age, and I mean the kind of common good oriented activists my age are often in a bit of despair and often in a bit of hopelessness, and also still often we're dividing the world into us and them. The concern I have for younger people's storytelling is more on the despair, depression, meaninglessness, sense of kind of catastrophe and crisis that seems to me to be a very loud version of what most young people go through, and I certainly went through in my teens and 20s. But it's just that the social media bombardment and political polarization seems to confirm those fears. And when you haven't been alive long enough to see that some of these things seem to be cyclical, it can be very easy to fall under that despair. So but in terms of inclusion, who belongs, who's welcome, your story is valid. Clearly, the younger you get, the more that's being promoted. We need to help each other find containers for telling the story in a way that's maybe not so narcissistic as it can sometimes be. But it's often not. It's often so tender when you hear a younger person tell their story. And it's often so challenging when you hear a younger person saying, you can't say that. Don't say that about that person, So anyway, I think we need to be learning from each other. You can get the book wherever you buy books. It's helpful for it to be bought anywhere that it will be noticed. There are links to buy it at the7thstory.com. If you buy it between now and I believe the 1st of January 2024, you can get an ebook of that essay book, The Seventh Story, Us, Them, and the End of Violence, for free. And the details on that, on how to get that book, are on the7thstory.com. And the last piece for me is we're having an event in March called the Porch Gathering, which is founded on this idea of transformative storytelling. and it's in Asheville, North Carolina. You can find out about that event at theporchgathering.com. And Brian, I'd love to hear anything you've got coming up in person, and maybe tell people about the podcast too.
Yeah, well, and also we've recorded this, so we'll let you know the link for all who registered for it. So feel free to share this with others. And I put in the chat the link for all the ordering information for the book. Gareth is my guest on a podcast I do called Learning How to See from the Center for Action and Contemplation, and we did a whole we have a whole episode that's unrolling right now. About these 7 stories. So encourage folks to check those out.
Yay. And people can find me at mickyscapejones.com. I'm the only Mickey Scape Jones that exists. So you can Google me, you can find my website quite easily. And I'm just so thankful for this moment to pause and to breathe and to discover new ways of thinking and being together. Thanks for everybody who joined us for this webinar, and to everyone who will watch it afterwards. Let's stay in conversation and dreaming about the possibilities. So thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for hosting. Good night.